We shift our focus to this story now. A coalition of South African trade unions, political groups and civil society organizations are picketing outside the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria today. They condemn what they describe as the U.S. military invasion of Venezuela and the abduction of Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores. COSATU says it supports the protests, adding that the U.S. actions violate international law and Venezuela's sovereignty. SABC News reporter Ditaba Tsotsetse is at the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria and joins us live with the very latest. Good afternoon, Ditaba. Let's firstly start with some of the groupings present there. Which have you caught sight of?
The leadership of the Communist Party of Swaziland, led by its national chairperson, Comrade Katie Wemabas.
Long live Venezuela, long live! Long live! Long live Venezuela, long live! Long live! Down, Trump, down! Down, Trump, down!
We have the leadership of the Young Communist League of South Africa, led today by National Committee member, Comrade Sarah Mukweo.
Jigijela, ufasimba jigijela! Jigijela, ufasimba jigijela! Jigijela! Venezuela, long live! Long live! Long live Venezuela, long live! Long live!
We have the anti-fascist international movement today, represented and led by Comrade Mohamed Desai.
Long live the undying spirit of Comrade Fidel Castro, long live!
Long live!
A coalition of South African trade unions, political groups and civil society organizations are picketing outside the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria. They condemn what they described as the U.S. military invasion of Venezuela and the abduction of President Nicolas Maduro and the First Lady. COSATU says it supports the protest, adding that the U.S. actions violate international law and Venezuela's sovereignty. SABC News reporter Ditaba Tsotsetse is outside the embassy in the capital and joins us now live. And Ditaba, how's the turnout looking out there, given how strongly opposed the COSATU and SACP have been to the U.S.'s action?
Venezuela has once again become the center of global geopolitical tension as recent developments involving the United States triggered international reactions far beyond Latin America. Reports of intensified U.S. actions targeting the Venezuelan government, including expanded sanctions enforcement, covert operations, and the detention of senior Venezuelan officials, have reshaped diplomatic relationships and reignited debates around sovereignty, intervention, and international law. These developments unfolded against the backdrop of Venezuela's prolonged economic crisis, political polarization, and strategic importance as a major oil-producing nation. The Venezuelan political crisis has its roots in years of economic decline marked by hyperinflation, currency collapse, infrastructure deterioration, and mass emigration. U.S. sanctions, first expanded significantly in 2017 and later intensified, were designed to pressure the Venezuelan government to implement democratic reforms. However, critics argued that these sanctions deepened humanitarian suffering by restricting access to international financial systems, limiting imports of critical goods, and accelerating economic isolation. Supporters of the sanctions maintained that the measures targeted elites rather than civilians and were necessary to curb alleged corruption and authoritarianism. Recent reports of U.S. security operations linked to Venezuela sparked global controversy. While U.S. officials framed these actions as necessary measures to protect regional stability and enforce international norms, many governments and civil society organizations viewed them as unilateral and escalatory. The situation escalated further when reports emerged that Venezuelan leadership figures were detained during overseas operations connected to U.S. enforcement efforts. These reports, while contested and politically sensitive, became a catalyst for protests and diplomatic condemnation across several regions. South Africa quickly emerged as a focal point of international response. In Pretoria, demonstrators gathered outside the U.S. Embassy to protest American actions in Venezuela, accusing Washington of violating international law and undermining national sovereignty. Protesters carried signs condemning foreign intervention and called for respect for Venezuela's right to self-determination. The demonstrations were organized by political parties, labor unions, and civil society groups aligned with anti-imperialist and non-aligned foreign policy traditions. South Africa's history of resistance to external domination shaped the tone of the protests, drawing parallels between Venezuela's situation and historical struggles against foreign interference. South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation issued statements expressing concern over unilateral actions and emphasized the importance of multilateral engagement through the United Nations. Officials reiterated South Africa's commitment to principles of sovereignty, peaceful conflict resolution, and adherence to international law. Calls were made for the UN Security Council to urgently address the situation, reflecting Pretoria's broader foreign policy stance favoring diplomacy over military or coercive measures. The protests in South Africa were not isolated events but part of a broader global reaction. In Latin America, several governments voiced concern over escalating tensions, while others aligned more closely with U.S. positions. In Africa, Venezuela's long-standing diplomatic outreach through energy cooperation, educational exchanges, and South-South solidarity programs contributed to sympathetic responses. Venezuela's historical engagement with African nations during the non-aligned movement era strengthened political ties that resurfaced during the crisis. China and Russia also played critical roles in shaping the international response. Both countries condemned what they described as U.S. interference and reiterated support for Venezuela's sovereignty. China emphasized dialogue and political solutions while highlighting its economic interests in Venezuela's oil and infrastructure sectors. Russia framed the situation as evidence of Western double standards in international relations. These responses underscored how Venezuela remains a strategic arena in the broader competition among global powers. Within Venezuela, the domestic impact of escalating international pressure continued to shape political and social conditions. The government used foreign condemnation to rally nationalist sentiment, portraying itself as defending the nation against external aggression. State media emphasized international protests as proof of global solidarity, while opposition groups argued that international pressure was necessary to force political change. The polarization deepened, complicating prospects for negotiated solutions. The economic consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Venezuela's oil exports faced additional logistical and financial obstacles as companies reassessed risk exposure. Energy markets reacted cautiously, particularly as global supply chains remained sensitive to geopolitical disruptions. While Venezuela's oil output had already declined sharply over the past decade, any further instability threatened to tighten supply in certain markets, especially where Venezuelan crude blends remained relevant. South Africa's response resonated across the African continent. Political movements in other countries echoed calls for non-intervention and respect for sovereignty. The episode reinforced Africa's evolving role as an increasingly vocal participant in global geopolitical debates rather than a passive observer. African governments, while diverse in their alignments, demonstrated growing willingness to assert independent foreign policy positions, particularly when issues of sovereignty and international law were involved. The situation also reignited debate about the effectiveness and morality of sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Humanitarian organizations warned that ordinary Venezuelans continued to bear the brunt of economic restrictions, with shortages of medicine, food insecurity, and infrastructure challenges persisting. Advocates for sanctions countered that easing pressure without political reform risked entrenching existing power structures. The debate highlighted the complexity of balancing human rights concerns with geopolitical objectives. Media coverage of the protests and international reactions varied widely by region. Western outlets often framed events through the lens of democracy promotion and security concerns, while media in the global South emphasized sovereignty, historical patterns of intervention, and power imbalances in the international system. This divergence reflected broader information divides shaping global public opinion. The protests in Pretoria symbolized more than opposition to a single policy decision. They reflected deeper frustrations with perceived inequities in global governance structures, where powerful states are seen as acting with impunity while smaller nations face severe consequences for similar actions. For many protesters, Venezuela became a symbol of resistance against a global order viewed as unequal and coercive. The United States defended its actions by citing concerns over regional stability, narcotics trafficking, and alleged human rights violations. Officials emphasized that measures were aimed at specific individuals rather than the Venezuelan population. Diplomatic channels remained active, though strained, as U.S. representatives sought to reassure allies while countering criticism from non-aligned states. The unfolding events also influenced domestic political debates within the United States. Critics questioned the strategic value of continued confrontation with Venezuela amid competing global priorities, while supporters argued that maintaining pressure was essential to uphold democratic norms. These debates mirrored earlier divisions over U.S. foreign policy interventions in other regions. As the crisis evolved, attention turned to potential pathways forward. Diplomatic mediation efforts by neutral countries and international organizations were proposed, though progress remained uncertain. Trust deficits between the parties, compounded by years of sanctions and political hostility, made negotiations difficult. Nonetheless, calls for dialogue persisted, particularly from countries advocating multipolar cooperation. South Africa's stance underscored its broader foreign policy orientation, which emphasizes multilateralism and solidarity with developing nations. The country's leadership positioned the protests and diplomatic statements as consistent with constitutional values and historical experience. This approach resonated with segments of the global audience increasingly skeptical of unilateral power projection. The Venezuela situation also highlighted shifting global power dynamics. As emerging economies assert greater influence, responses to international crises are becoming more fragmented and contested. The era of near-universal alignment with Western policy positions is giving way to a more pluralistic landscape where multiple narratives coexist. Economic analysts observed that prolonged instability in Venezuela continued to deter large-scale foreign investment despite the country's vast natural resources. Any future recovery would likely require both internal reforms and a recalibration of international relations. The current crisis underscored how geopolitical tensions can delay economic normalization even when opportunities exist. Humanitarian conditions remained a central concern. Millions of Venezuelans living abroad continued to monitor developments closely, with diaspora communities advocating for peaceful solutions and improved living conditions back home. Remittances played a crucial role in sustaining families, while international aid organizations navigated complex regulatory environments shaped by sanctions. As protests subsided in Pretoria, the broader implications lingered. The demonstrations added to a growing record of African civil society engagement with global issues, challenging narratives that portray the continent as disengaged from international politics. Instead, Africa's responses to the Venezuela crisis illustrated increasing agency and diplomatic confidence. The long-term outcome of the crisis remained uncertain. Whether the episode would lead to renewed negotiations, further escalation, or gradual de-escalation depended on decisions made by multiple actors across continents. What was clear was that Venezuela's situation continued to reverberate globally, shaping conversations about power, sovereignty, and the future of international relations. In the context of a rapidly changing world order, the protests in South Africa served as a reminder that geopolitical actions rarely remain confined to their immediate regions. Decisions taken in Washington echoed in Pretoria, Caracas, Beijing, and beyond. Venezuela's crisis thus became not only a national issue but a global test of how nations respond to conflict, intervention, and the principles that underpin the international system. As the international community grappled with these challenges, the Venezuela situation remained a focal point for debates over diplomacy versus coercion, multilateralism versus unilateralism, and the evolving balance of power in the 21st century. The reactions it generated, particularly in South Africa, highlighted the enduring relevance of these questions and the growing voices demanding a more equitable global order.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.